Get ready for the big move.
Okay. Hello and welcome to Fireman's Hall Museum's membership meeting night. This is our final 4 series meetings that we do every year starting in November. And tonight we are in for a great doozy. We are a presentation given by Stephen Heaver from the Fire Museum of Maryland. Just a little bit about our presenter tonight, who will be accompanied by his IT person from the Fire Museum of Maryland's Aaron Lippincott. Stephen Heaver has been working on fire engines since the age of 12. He has been the museum curator for over 50 years and has been the director since 2002. Steam engines and pumping stations are amongst his favorite topics, but so many more other areas of interpretation is where Steve is strong at. And presenting us tonight, Steve Heaver for the Fire Museum of Maryland. Steve, thank you, and now I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. It's very nice to be with you, and I'm hoping to share some really good information with you this evening about the Fire Museum of Maryland. We're located just above the Baltimore Beltway, so very easy to get to. We have an extensive collection of about 40 pieces of equipment dating from 1806, and I'm very pleased to be able to share some of those with you. I understand that with your own background, you're familiar with the fabulous museum there in Philadelphia, and so you're going to have familiarity with what we're going to talk about tonight. Basically, the Fire Museum of Maryland emphasizes urban firefighting, American urban firefighting, and so we're going to start back a little before American, just to pick up a few pieces, and as soon as we get the PowerPoint up and rolling, we'll be ready to go. The Baltimore City started its official firefighting back in 1763, but as you know, firefighting predated that, and your own Benjamin Franklin was extremely critical in getting that rolling. And so, in fact, you have some Newsham engines in your collection. We don't. Our first piece is in 1806. So let's see, what do we have here? So are you familiar with the Sestibius, who invented, or we're going to say invented, the pump? There's a drawing there with blue and red arrows, and he was an amazing inventor. And the engine that you see on the lower left is from maybe a European museum, I'm not really sure, but it's a reconstruction of a European engine from the 17th century. The one on the lower right is a Newsham, and you have, what, one of those or two? I think you have two, maybe a Newsham rag. And so Newsham was the person that built the engines that were used in the United States for many, many years. And we end up with a fellow by the name of Pat Lyon, who comes over from London in 1790. You can see him there in full regalia as a blacksmith. It's very unusual to have a portrait that was full length. Even somebody like Paul Revere didn't have a full length portrait. So all of the engines, all of the water, everything had to be handled by hand. And as you know, buckets were absolutely critical. The one on the left there, Mr. O'Brien, was more typical because it just has a name. The one on the right with the coat of arms was from a wealthier family. But when the fire was over, everybody went down to the common and collected their buckets. And the drawing you see in the upper left corner dates from 1745, And by that time, they were already using a machine to push the water harder and faster to the buildings. The picture that you see on the lower right was built by Pat Lyon, and it's been painted to look as closely as possible to what we think it might have looked like. And it was as I said, it was built in 1806. Now, let me see. So we've already talked about Mr. Franklin, and everybody's aware that this painting was done much later because he's shown with a helmet that dates probably from the 1880s, right? So we don't really know what firefighters wore at the time that Franklin was about, and I'm going to say that they probably just wore their tricorners or their skull caps. And the first idea that we have for a hat of some kind is closer to about 1815, which was inspired by the caps that the sailors wore on the ships. The next step after that in terms of caps was the cardboard or the pasteboard cap or hat that you see here that they used in parades. And this image dates from about 1828, I believe it is, or 35. And this with the capes and so forth, by that time they had developed a full regalia for parades. So let's go back to firefighting for a minute and look at the hose that they used. We're reconstructing a piece of leather hose. Ultimately, it will be 9 feet long. And we're using some of our leather hose to be a model for building this. And so I'm able to say to you, because of our own experimentation, that one cow, a good sized cow, will provide 9 feet of hose. So the original hose was, a typical section of hose was 50 feet long, but they also had sections that were 25 feet long, and the couplings were basically 2.5 inches. Not always, but usually. So the standards that were being set back in 1807 and moving into the 1820s were standards which we continue to use today. What you're seeing here is a hartshorn reel that was developed sometime in the 1860s. So think Civil War, but I want you to imagine that the first hose conveyances were being developed about 1809 up in New York City, and there was actually a wagon, but this one, I mean, the most common were wheels, and they put the hose onto the wheels. Why? Because the hose could not be folded. It's leather. So as the leather dried for after the fire, they would swab it with tallow or beef oil, and it was, I'm sure, smelled really lovely, but they couldn't fold it. So let's see. We've got the point I'd like to make here. We're going to diverge for 100 years for a minute and look at this 1920 Seagrave, which we're in the throes of finishing up right now. But this picture was taken about a year ago. So in the Fire Museum, we have a lot of pieces which are being operated, and we take a great deal of pride in keeping them functional so that we can show new generations how these machines work. And when you come to visit the museum, if you come on a special day, we'll be able to show these to you outside pumping, but we've got lots of videos and things working inside as well, and we're hoping to set up more demonstrations this coming summer. So check our website and stay tuned. So I'm going to go back now in time to the hose reels, and this is a Jefferson Nuttall, which was made in Philadelphia, and we're still looking for more information on Mr. Jeffries and Mr. Nuttall. They built these carriages. This one was made for just for parades. So it's extremely elaborate. The fellow you see in the top left corner is cleaning the silver. They're using repoussé here, which was being introduced in Philadelphia the year before or 2 years before in 1817. And we've cleaned this partially so that people can see what it looked like. The bigger reels that had 4 wheels could carry up to 900 feet. The smaller ones were more like 700 feet. These pictures show the very dramatic and decorative apparel that they wore, and I think it's very impressive. They're mostly handcrafted from leather or fabrics, or they're hand painted from cardboard. And the fellow that you see on the left there wearing his cardboard hat would have had that on just for parades. So if you think for a moment about what the Richard Newsham engine looked like, you'll recognize a friend. This machine was built in 1839 by James Smith up in New York City, and it's known as a New York style, but as you can see, it really emulates the Newsham engines. The machinery was in the big section, the decorative section in the back, but that chamber just covered the machinery and kept some of the water off of the machinery. This particular unit was used up in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and the way it looks in the picture here is from 1893 when they repainted it a third time just for parades. So the bridge that you see on the right is from in the middle of Pawtucket, and the building to the right is the Slater Mill. And you can see that in the photograph below with the streetcar going across the bridge. And that's original to our 1839 Smith. So we have another Smith. This one was made in 53, and this is known as a crane neck. And this is also a first size engine. So we went from a village engine to a big city engine. And this unit we also operate, and it would take about 18 to 24 men to operate for 3 minutes at a time. And somebody else would then step in and take your place. This shows the reconstructions of the paintings, which we've done as a typical painting fore and aft. We do not know what this vehicle really looked like when it was new, but we've studied New York style engines, and we're pretty confident that this could have been on this engine. So now we're going to switch from New York to Philadelphia, and hence your namesake, Philadelphia style engine. And this engine is built or was built in Baltimore by John Rogers, who also had himself a full-size portrait, which is very unusual. And what we've elected to do is paint and gild just a section through the middle so that you can see, or visitors can see, what it was like to realize this engine when it was new. The oil paintings have been cleaned by a professional conservator. So about the time that engine was built, we're moving into the Civil War, and the Civil War was the harbinger of many significant things for the fire department, one of which was switching in the cities from volunteer to career. Also in the cities, switching from hand-drawn to horse-drawn, and also in the cities, switching from hand-pumped to steam-operated. And all this, though this Clapham Jones in front of you was made in 1878, it's really of a much earlier pattern. And if you look at the Rainey and Neefy at your museum, which is the earliest extant machine in the United States, I think you'll see a lot of similarities there between the two engines, but this one was small enough that it could be pulled by hand. So I mentioned the Civil War, and here's a bit about our mayor at that time, Mayor Swan. He was the one that introduced the career department. It was not a simple or easy switch in Baltimore that took place in 1859, and it wasn't altogether successful when it first started, and so a few years later they had to basically start over, and they hired more of the Civil War veterans, which helped their disciplinary problems a great deal. So at that point, we're going to think about horse-drawn equipment. You might say this was the glory days of the fire department. People think about pictures and puzzles or toys. Frequently, their mind goes to these gorgeous steam engines. Some were pulled by 2 horses, some by 3, depending on how large the steamer was or how many hills they had to negotiate. So San Francisco, for instance, everything was pulled by 3 horses. Baltimore had a mixture, and I'm sure that Philadelphia also had a mixture. So they had to house all these machines and the horses. The firefighters were not very happy with the initial switch because they loved their firehouses that were very well appointed, and they had dinners and dances there. It was a big social area. However, when the horses came in, the horses had to be accompanied with paid staff, and the paid staff had to maintain the horses, and basically it would have been living in a barn. So if you were a firefighter, I don't know how happy you would have been about moving from a plush facility to living in a barn, but that's what they were asked to do, and they followed suit. I'm going to show you a picture of an 1871 firehouse that was built in Baltimore for the early career department. And like most firehouses throughout the entire United States, it had one central door and 2 side personnel doors. The first floor section is all cast iron. The top is wood and brick. So the color picture shows what it looked like just before it was torn down. And we have the cast iron portion here at the museum, and we've reconstructed it all. It was about a $74,000 project. So we interpret life in the firehouse here, and it's very impressive, if I do say so myself. And it took a lot of time just to figure out where we were going to put this structure, because obviously it was not going to be moved once it was installed. The doors, the central doors, have been reconstructed from canvas and plexiglass, actually not plexi, mylar. And if you've never been down for a visit, I encourage you to come. We're working on another facade right now that's the 3rd floor portion of a firehouse up in Oxford, PA, and that's from 1901, and it's all tin. So we're going to have that painted and erected in the museum in the next few months. A big component of the new professional fire department was fire alarm telegraph. So how did that work? I'm going to show you a few pictures of our fire alarm office. It took 11 years to design this office, and it covers some basic periods of fire alarm, so you can actually trace how the system evolved over the time. But the man that we think about the most when we think about fire alarm telegraph is the fellow on the right, and his name is John Gamewell, and he was the genius that, or at least he was a combination of a genius and an entrepreneur who took the information and technology from people like Moses Crane, who were clockmakers, and Friendly Breese, Samuel Breese, Samuel Morse, Samuel Finley Breese Morse, who was in the lower left corner. And the machinery you see in the middle is from New York City and Baltimore, and that was from 52. Baltimore's system was installed in 59. Not sure when Philadelphia's was, but it must have been right in there. There were about 9 cities that had telegraph systems. So here we are in our current office, and I'm very proud of the white unit that you see in the top left photograph. That white is marble, and that dates from 1859, which actually was made by friends of Gamewell for Baltimore City. And I believe that it was, or is, the first piece of telegraph, or the earliest piece of telegraph machinery to be exhibited in the United States. I'm going to move along to another significant development, because the telegraph was enormously important, because it gave everyone, no matter what economic strata you were. If you lived in Philadelphia or in Baltimore, there was a telegraph system, and you could go out on the street and pull a hook and you would have help. So this predates the telephone by over 30 years. So here is another major change for American firefighting, and the man in the middle, bottom middle, is Charles T. Holloway. Some of you might recognize him. He was a very instrumental person, not only in the Baltimore firefighting development, but throughout the Eastern Seaboard. And he eventually started making fire engines, and I think that would be about 1870s. And he sold some pieces down to South America as well. So the machine that you see on the left is incomplete, and it was made in 1881 for a company up in Massachusetts. And we will be doing some sort of a reconstruction on this piece in the next 5 to 10 years. We need to reconstruct quite a bit of the machinery, so that it's going to be an expensive undertaking. If you're interested in helping with this, give me a call. So what does chemistry or chemicals have to do with anything? You probably heard the term STEM for of course, you're not going to remember, it's technology. It was science, technology, engineering, and math. Okay. So one of the things that we do with our STEM programs is chemically related mixture of soda, and we don't use sulfuric acid, but we allow children to mix chemicals, and it creates a gas, which is what was happening in that tank that you saw before. And the gas creates pressure and propels the water through what modern firefighters would call a booster hose. And I might say that one of the things that we here at the Fire Museum are beginning to reinterpret this year is the fact that this vehicle wasn't just bringing chemicals to the fire. It's really bringing water. The chemicals only created the pressure. And so firefighters had always tried to find ways to get water to the fire, and that bringing water to the source. So this was the first attempt in America to bring water to the fire in a contained a vessel. And you see an example here of some of the kids outside putting out a fake fire using their very own pressurized vessels. Another example of these pressurized vessels is on our 1927 Thermont, and you can see them midship, and they're nickel plated, and they're all original. This is an amazing machine, but like the first piece that I showed you, there are two tanks. Most chemical engines in the horse-drawn days only had one tank because they were more concerned about carrying the hose. But in Thermont, they needed a lot more self-sufficient water than other places. So they had two tanks. And while one tank was being used, they could recharge the first tank. One tank would last about 5 minutes, just like an early 1920s booster hose, a booster system. It was about 5 minutes. Okay, so if you had a little more money and you could put more men, trained men on the street, you went with steam, because steam was unlimited and could create enormous quantities of pressure, which meant creating enormous quantities of water if you had a hydrant system. And Philadelphia and Baltimore and New York sort of vie for that 1807 slot as to who had the first hydrant system. But those hydrant systems were critical. Many of these engines were intended to draft from basins of water like your harbor or rivers, and that's fine. They needed to be versatile. So the engine you see on the left is our 1899 American, and it's a smaller engine. It's a third size, so it puts out 500 gallons a minute, which would be about half of what your modern engine responding on the streets of Philadelphia can do. But they had steam engines that could do much more. So when your city was ready to buy a new engine, just like in the days with the hand-drawn pieces, they would choose the size of engine that they needed in order to do the job, shall we say. The picture on the right shows the same engine, but with gold leaf being added to the frame. And you can see that the frame is much darker red than the wheels, which is another very common thing to happen. So we're going to look at another steam engine. This is a Clappin Jones from 1888, which is the year that the firehouse in the background was being built and dedicated. And this fire engine also fought the Great Fire of Baltimore in 1904. So here's another piece that fought the Great Fire in 1904. When it was in the fire, it was pulled by 3 horses. And maybe you know the story of Goliath. We'll get to that in a moment. But the water tower was similar to the water towers that were used in Philadelphia. And the point of the of the water tower was to get this long spindly thing up in the air, like you see in the lower left corner. And then engine companies or high pressure systems could pump a lot of water up as much as 8 or 9 stories in the air. And that's what they needed, because at the time that these water towers were being built, all of the ladder companies were made of wood. The ladders, the main sticks were made of wood, and they could not sustain that kind of back pressure. And so it was a long, long time before the fire department had the ability to pump water at a very high level. The church steeples and apartment buildings and offices. The horse that you see on the lower right is Goliath, and he was our hero from 1904, and he single-handedly got the water tower turned and away from the Hearst building before it exploded. Otherwise, the water tower would have been covered in rubble, like we also lost an aerial ladder at the fire. Everybody has at least one big fire. I know you all did. Baltimore's big fire was in 1904. And the thing that made it particularly significant in world history was that it was the first fire that took place after the introduction of steel and concrete. And there were a lot of engineers and architects that were interested in how these buildings survived, and the fire code, the fire protection codes that were being used or that were being ignored because people were lazy and the fire spread because of open elevator shafts and that sort of thing. So after 1904, there was a huge shift in the fire codes. And this is the telephone exchange. And this is the black area shows about a square mile of the fire, which roared through the city for 2.5 days. So as a result of the fire, there were several things that happened. One was they put in a high pressure pumping station and a high pressure system. So new piping, like the hydrants they had on the surface, but these hydrants were designed to withstand 250, actually 300 pounds of pressure. And the firefighters accessed these hydrants with special hydrant chucks that they carried on their apparatus and screwed into the streets after they got to the fire. So the gauges you see on the left were or are an example of a set of gauges and valves from one of the 3 coreless steam engines that provided the water pressure. So about that time, we're making a huge shift from horses to motorized pieces. And I think this is a great photograph. Does anybody tell me who made this fire engine? Brian knows. Yeah. Okay, so this is it's an American LaFrance, and it's unusual in that it has a windshield. So anyway, as the gasoline engines were being introduced, there were a lot of controversies and a lot of soul searching as to what created the most reliable piece of equipment. Because after all, it was the firefighters' experience with this equipment which told the designers what they needed to know in order to make the next step forward. And we're going to show you a picture of a steamer that can do 1,100 gallons a minute. And it has a Christie tractor on the front. So it's a gasoline tractor. Horses have been replaced, and this is now able to function with the gasoline engine for another 10 to 25 years. And they did, partly because the fire chiefs were not comfortable with the early gasoline engines for pumping water, and the manufacturers of the pumping engines, quite frankly, had a lot of problems developing the technology to make the gasoline engine and the drive shaft go into a pump mechanism and pump the water in a reliable way. So we're going to speed through some of these things. This is a 1916 Mack, which has gone through a number of lifestyle changes, life changes. And the way we've restored the picture, the bottom picture, is from the mid-20s. So it still has solid tires, still has its early screened hood, but now we have a pump under the seat, which could do about 500 gallons a minute. And it's got 3 high pressure pumps. Some people call them boat pipes, but they were intended to be connected to the high pressure system, and they could, a couple of these sitting in an intersection could supply more water than 11 steamers sitting in the same intersection, assuming that you could have gotten 11 steamers into an intersection, which you could not. All right, so we're going to look at something else which is also quite early, but it brings up a whole new idea of how do you get broken fire engines back to the repair shop. And this Mack Bulldog was one of, I'm going to say 4 Mack tow trucks made for fire departments in the United States. This is the only one surviving, and we've restored this very accurately to look the way it did when it was new. And we put this in parades. The fire department, Baltimore City Fire Department, used this well into the 40s. So if you think about those solid tires bouncing down the street, you sort of felt like you had to have a kidney transplant by the time you got to the fire. And there was no need to rush, because the more you rushed, the more it rattled your body apart. And this, you see, you wouldn't know that unless you drove these machines and had an experience with these solid tire vehicles. And you wouldn't know how they steered or they stopped. You know, and stopping's a big issue, or how the gasoline functioned if you don't operate these vehicles. So I'm going to move to this engine was built in 1920, and here's another one that was built in 1920. You saw a picture of it earlier, but this one has balloon tires. So the fire chief up in Ridgeway, Pennsylvania, which is mid-state out on the turnpike, was very forward-thinking, and he ordered these balloon tires. Now, balloon tires were not very reliable, and they could blow, but the other thing about this piece is it's got a big 6-cylinder engine, and it's pushing water with a centrifugal pump. And it's built by Seagrave, and that's a name you might recognize. They're still in business, and Seagrave was a champion of centrifugal pumps. So another thing that fire chiefs were very skeptical about is centrifugal pumps just didn't have the history of reliability, and they had to be primed. So there were a lot of different issues with centrifugal pumps. But after 1927, then we see centrifugal pumps everywhere. Centrifugal pumps became the norm after 1927, because that's when they introduced the series parallel pump. So I'm going to go back in time just a wee bit and show you one with solid tires. This machine we just purchased in August, and it is a 1913 Aaron's Fox. It is the only one left in the world of this model, and it is all original except for the upholstery on the seat. And it is an amazing story of how Aaron's Fox engineers developed things like grease fittings and oil cups and oil coolers and engine coolers in order to make a gasoline engine pump water. And if you think about it, in 1912, which firefighters would have known how to drive a gasoline engine? Probably 1 in 500. So the men that were firefighters at that period, that were making the transition from horses to gasoline, they had to be taught how to drive these machines. In Baltimore in 1904, at the time of the Great Fire, there were 5 men who owned automobiles. That's it. 5 automobiles on the streets in Baltimore in 1904. So from 1904 to 1912 or 13, things really took off, and we started to experiment with gasoline. I might add that the firefighters were just as irritated with the gasoline as they were with the smells of the horses, but they had become used to the horses and they loved those horses. They were not happy about losing their horses. This is another Aaron's Fox. This is from 1922, which by that time they had developed a single ball in the front as opposed to the double dome, the pancakes. And further, I have to say that this piece is the way it looked in 1939 when the repair shop rebuilt it, repainted it, and re-chromed it, or chromed it. And we put this piece on the street, and we run this in parades. And it pumps, I might say, 100%. Okay, so we've got another piece here, which is in the same period, and this one is from, well, it's the Marion Fire Company, and I want to say it's in Bradbury, Vermont. Does that ring a bell? I think it's Vermont. And it's been beautifully restored. Every line, right out of the box, beautiful, beautifully done. This is a piece much more typical of fire engines that were being made in the 20s. Unlike the Fox, which had the ball and the pump on the front, this has the pump behind or under the seat. And this is like your American LaFrances. American LaFrances were very, very popular in Philadelphia and many other cities. American LaFrances were also very popular in the rural areas because they were lighter and they didn't require the heavy maintenance and the well-built roads that Seagraves and Aaron's Foxes required. So we're going to move on through the 30s and up into the 50s. This is a 35 Stutz, and yes, it's made by the same company that did the Stutz racing cars. They did do a handful of engines, and this shows an open cab with a windshield. Now this one shows, this is a 41 American LaFrance, which is in original condition, and this has a door. Oh, now we have a door and a windshield. And I can tell you from personal experience that having a door makes all the difference in the world in your comfort in the winter. It's also very much better for your safety. You're not as likely to get thrown out on the street. And the other thing I'm going to mention about this piece is that under that hood, that long, big, massive hood, there's a V12, a little tiny V12 engine. So the size of the hood is actually made that big to suit the overall architecture of the machine, but the visual of the fire engine. That's all sheet metal, that's all air, because the engine is down inside there as the V12. And the next piece you're going to see is another V12 made by American LaFrance also, but this is a 1947, and it represents the most amazing thing in the 20th century, short of maybe the series parallel centrifugal or the articulating rescue, the basket. And that's a cab forward. So if you're old enough to remember the 40s and the 50s, all the children's books and the toys were all about this model. And it's a dream to drive. And it's just an amazing piece of equipment to operate. I might say that initially this was referred as a suicide cab because its detractors were sure that there would be lots and lots of firefighters killed driving these cab forward units. The engine is behind the driver. I should have explained that earlier. However, that turned out to be wrong because these vehicles saved the firefighters so many times from having head-on collisions because the drivers could see what was happening in the intersection before they pulled out into the intersection. So sometimes it's referred to as a streetcar because of the bug lights on the headlights. The other thing was called the bathtub. All right, so we're going from 47 to another 47, and this is a Mack, and it's a Baltimore City piece with a 25 kW kilowatt generator, separate engine to drive the generator, And here we are at a big mansion downtown for a lighting demonstration. As remember that fires just don't take place in the daytime when everybody's awake. In fact, most fires, well, maybe I shouldn't say that. I'll let Brian say that, but there are a lot of fires that take place at night because we are asleep, and we let our guard down and fires start, which is why the smoke detectors are so very important. But this vehicle has 6 lights on the top, each one of which has a 1500-watt bulb in it. And it's very impressive in this lovely picture, but the pumping engine that drives down your street today has one little light on the back that's maybe a foot long, and it can do more than all of these lights put together. So there's an example of how technology has moved ahead. And we're going to look at another Mack before we finish here. And this is a 49. And I wish I had more of a side view to show you, but this is a Model L, which is a very, very popular Mack model. And the thing that I'd like you to focus on for a minute is the windshield and the cab. And the cab is actually big enough for a bench seat in the back. So you could fit 5 men in the cab easily, maybe even 6. And we think that as early as 49, when this city in West Virginia had this on order, that they were thinking about their mutual aid to other towns and maybe the hills, and the amount of time that they were going to spend in the winter driving around up and down between towns. We don't really know. We're still looking into that. But the cabs were the thing of the future, and that's what we have today. And that would be a story for another talk. So we hope that you'll come visit us at the Fire Museum. We have 2 or 3, well, at least 3 major, 4 major events every year. Check our website. It's firemuseummd.org. It's right there in front of you on the screen. Look us up and check out our archives and other things that we have to offer. And please come see us. So with that, Brian, I understand you might have some questions.
Sure, hold on. We have one question there. What are the favorite exhibits at your museum for the visitors?
Oh, I don't think I've ever been asked that question before. All right, so one of them would be the earlier hand-drawn pieces where we have buckets and we allow people to pump a small engine. Another one would be the steam engine that we have with horses in mannequins in that facade that you saw. I think that one of the favorites will become our 1920 Seagrave because it is so spectacular. But then there are about 8 movies and soundtracks that are running constantly, and they're always good. But the Discovery Room is always the kids' favorite because they can climb on a full-size fire engine and try on miniature gear.
The next question is, what school programs do you offer?
Well, we offer many school programs, which are also on our website. We can also offer synchronized virtual tours. Right now, we developed those, and we encourage you to sign up for a tour. I think they're what, 100, is it 75, 175, 200? $200 for a tour so you can sign up for 5 people or 30 people. And then we have in-person tours. We also do outreach tours like PowerPoints and that kind of thing. So we have a very extensive education program under the leadership of Aaron Lippincott, who's the one sitting next to me here, and it's keeping me on track. Yeah, there he is.
The next question is on the previous slide before the end. Can you explain the Mack dog hood ornament?
Well, sure. Shall I go back or are we off the screen?
No.
Can I go back? Okay. So the ornament of it's a bulldog's about 5 inches high. And the concept of the bulldog was evolving during World War I when we sent a lot of these Macks over to England, and they were extremely rugged, and the British started calling them bulldogs. And it's partly because it had a snub nose because the radiator was behind the engine. So they were both rugged, and they had a rounded front that looked a little bit like a bulldog. Now, the ornament itself didn't start to evolve until about 1931, when the Mack company had already, by that time, adopted the name Bulldog as one of its main selling points. So then we started to see images of this Bulldog in a panel on the side or in a complete three-dimensional standing statue on the hood. And our bulldog is wearing his firefighter's attire for the winter.
What prompted your father to establish the museum?
You want the long answer or the short answer? Right. The short answer is that we're all nuts. But, it's nice to be crazy because it makes life more interesting. The slightly longer answer was that ever since he was a child, he was interested in fire engines and trucks, and he made enough money in his commercial real estate operations that he was able to start collecting fire engines. And then when I came along, I was also interested, and he decided that he would actually set up a museum.
Wow.
There's no endowment or trust that he left for us. So we have to scrounge for every nickel.
Amazing. Well, if there's any other questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Thank you very much, Steve. How often do you guys do the apparatus pumping? How many times a year do you guys do that?
The simple answer is that we do muster the first Saturday in May for hand and steam engines. And we're launching into our 50th anniversary this coming September. So next May will be an especially large and exciting steam and hand engine muster. The second one is in September, and it's the second Saturday of September, which was not designed to fall on the tragedy that hit this country in 01. Our motor muster predated that by a long, long time. So the September show is the second Saturday of September, and this year it's being sponsored by the Seagrave Corporation, and there's a lantern night in October. There's a family safety day in March. And as we develop some other pumps and self-contained things that we can let visitors do, they will be introduced on the floor. And we do, when weather permits, and staff, we offer rides on Saturdays at 11 o'clock. So the best thing to do is to check the website.
Okay. Thank you very much. Before we close out, to our visitors that are still with us, we are conducting a fundraiser now to expand our line of duty death wall, which is on the second floor of our museum, right underneath the famous stained glass window. This would be a new innovation of technology by having a kiosk, which would offer visitors to be able to touch the name on the screen and get an expansion of maybe pictures and stories of the actual member and what caused their death on the fire ground. So if you want to donate, here's all your information. Again, Steve, thank you very much for this great presentation. And to all our members, we hope to see you guys back again in November. And I challenge you to bring a friend with you. The more members, the more merrier. Thank you very much. Have a great one. Until next time.
All right, guys, I think we're going to sign off. It's been an absolute pleasure. So thank you for this opportunity.
No problem. Thank you
How
very
did
much.
I do?
Thank you, Steve. And I'll be in touch with you in just a few days with that information for the blueprints, okay?
Okay. Did I get to